Hi everybody, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Lou, and I like to research random topics that interest me and make video essays about that. If you like it, please subscribe, and if you don't like it, do not tell me because I will cry. Okay, so this is the last part of my deep dive on televangelism, and I have a feeling it's gonna be a lot longer than the previous two parts because I have like 23 pages of script when I usually have like 11. So I guess this is a podcast at this point, but yeah, let's get right back into it. So after having approached different techniques to attract donations and to win the loyalty of the audience over, and having explained all of the judicial loopholes, in this part we will focus on the danger of certain language and intentions of televangelists. So basically, what is legal is not automatically moral. We will start this part by looking into some televangelist scandals, and most specifically, how do they keep getting away with it? After that, we will analyze the content of the discourse broadcasted and the consequences of divulging misinformation to such a large audience. So that would be conspiracy theories, skepticism towards science, and all that good stuff. And finally, I will end this series by looking at the psychological aftermath inherent to leaving a religious movement in general. And also, general religious trauma. So let's jump into our first part. Scandals. How do they get away with it? So towards the end of the 80s, Word the Faith televangelists were faced with a wave of financial scandals and also sexual scandals. At the moment of all the scandals happening, the audience's trust in them was for sure strained and damaged. But in the long run, after a few months or a few years, their reputations end up being not that tarnished. So how did they gain the trust of their audience back throughout the years? In this part, we'll focus on three specific televangelists: Jim Bakker, Oral Roberts, and Jimmy Swaggart. Because all three of these cases were pretty specific and pretty unique. But before we dive into their individual stories, let's take a look at this survey conducted in April of 1991 by Tom W. Smith. He asked a panel of televangelist enthusiasts some targeted questions, once before the scandals, so in 1980, and once after the scandals had emerged between 1987 and 1989. The people were asked the following questions: do you think we can trust televangelists about money? Do you think televangelists are honest people? Do you think they are sincere? Do you think they have a special relationship with God? Do you think they care about people? And as we can see here, he accounted for the positive answers in the form of percentages. Overall, those results show a significant loss of trust from the audience towards the televangelists in the period following the scandals. In 1980, 41% of the audience trusted televangelists money-wise, and that number dropped to 16% in 1989. Same decrease in trust about their honesty. 53% of people said yes, they are honest in 1980, against 23% in 1989. We can clearly see that the yeses were divided by two between 1980 and 1989, aka after the scandals. However, if the trust towards televangelists was dented, the next part of the survey shows that the scandals hadn't stopped them from watching those same televangelists on TV. This is the next part of the study. So this points to a paradox. Could it mean that the negative opinion of a viewer towards their televangelist would not impact on the viewership? Let's keep those results in mind and keep going. Let's take a look at the three televangelists previously mentioned and dive into their stories. Let's start with Jimmy Swaggart. Swaggart, still don't know. But anyways, towards the end of 1987, a former employee of Swaggart Ministries, Assemblies of God, Marvin Gorman, reported to the authorities Jimmy Swaggart's illicit sexual activities after the latter had terminated him for an extramarital affair involving a woman who was a member of the ministry herself. Once Gorman's revelations hit the public, Jimmy admitted on the air, live from his own church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in February 1988, to have had paid the services of sex worker. He also confessed being the victim of an evil that had been within him since childhood, that would have pushed him time and time again to sin sexually.
I have sinned against you, my Lord. And I would ask that your precious blood would wash and cleanse every stain until it is in the seas of God's forgetfulness. Thank you.
This apology video with tears is heartfelt, full of emotions. He's basically asking God for forgiveness as well as his wife. He takes accountability in the form of withdrawing from his position and letting someone else take over, someone who would have been less of a sinner. So if y'all have been following and watching the first two parts of this series, you might have noticed something. His public apology completely lacks the notion of little gods that is so inherent to the prosperity gospel. As a reminder, the concept of little gods is the principle in the doctrine that preaches that every human is inherently perfect because we are all related to God. And yet, in his apology video, he implies that nobody's perfect. No one in his congregation seemed to have noticed that, however, because at the end of his speech, his congregation stands up and claps to salute his courage. Some of his followers are shocked and mad at him, but it is a tiny minority. At least it seems like it. Most of them are proud of his honesty. But not even 3 years later, in 1991, Jimmy was seen in California about to pick up a sex worker in his car. This time, he doesn't publicly confess. His son just releases a statement to the press that read along the lines of, "My dad is going to step down from the ministry temporarily to get some help and recover." Recover from what exactly? You're cheating on your wife, man. Anyways, well, Jimmy continues on with his life on the down low until 2009, when he decides to launch his new project, a TV channel called Sun Life Broadcasting Network that would broadcast religious content 24/7. And it is on that platform that Jimmy tried to reinvent himself and tried to gain the trust of his followers back. You would think that at this point he would just shut up about what he did in the 90s and not bring it up ever again, basically, but that's not what he did. He came forth with a new theory called preaching for the cross. That new theory would have been revealed to him basically in a dream, from what I'm gathering. Apparently, one of Jesus's apostles visited him in his sleep. That was Apostle Paul, following his unfortunate past adventures. The whole theory boils down basically to the fact that your faith is not one of the keys to a pure Christian life, but really the only one. Absolutely groundbreaking, if you ask me. So now repented, he managed to profit off of his scandals, and he expanded his TV channel to the UK, Asia, and some parts of Africa and the Middle East. As of the late 2010s, he reaps almost $2 million in donation each month. Moving on to Oral Roberts. He also encountered a big scandal in 1987. Back then, his ministry wasn't doing good, and he started this huge donations campaign in late 1986. The scandal happened in January of 87 when Oral Roberts asserted that if the donation didn't amount to $8 million by the spring, most specifically March, I quote, God would call him home. How dramatic is that? That was basically a euphemism to announce his death. The alarming announcement was successful because the donation surged to over $9 million before March even came about. After his dramatic announcement back in January, Robert had not been seen publicly until April, when he reappeared and declared upon seeing the success of his campaign, I quote, "It is April and I am alive and I am on fire." This man, I swear. Indeed, during his 3 months long retreat, he declared having regenerated as well as his healing powers. Good for him. Good for him. So he declared that the funds would be used to finance the ministry Back to Health and also fund the Oral Roberts University for medicine students specifically, because he wanted to send his medical students from this very Christian university out to Africa to be missionaries. Volunteerism. Actually, by the way, I might do a video about voluntarism because I think it's really, really interesting. It also ties into like the whole neo-colonialism thing, and that would be really interesting to analyze. So maybe next video will be about that. However, none of that ever happened. None of these students ever saw their tuition covered, and the campus hospital even had to shut down, causing almost 1,000 people to be unemployed overnight. People are getting tired of his divine callings, rightfully so. Side note, he had that hospital built there, the campus hospital, specifically because he had seen a 900-foot tall Jesus on the future construction site before it was built. Also, this is the man who heard God back in the day order him to buy a Buick. Anyways, all 777 beds in the campus hospital were nullified, basically. About that number is very specific because God told him that it was the best number at some point. So he just figured, yeah, just let me make like 777 beds in there. Blah, 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 blah. Anyways, following the scandals, he stepped down and let his son, Richard Roberts, take over. And his son successfully had people forget about his father's wrongdoings, basically. He rebranded the whole thing. He managed to reopen the hospital, and he managed to save the whole university, basically. Thanks to a millionaire friend of his, Mart Green, who donated $70 million in 2007 to nurse the hospital and the campus back to health. Oral Roberts passed away in 2009 at the age of 91, and a lot of the congregation still paid their respects. As of today, Richard Roberts, the son, still generates at least $8 million in donations per year, according to the Oklahoman. All right, and now on to the worst of them all, in my humble opinion, the controversy king, the one and only Jim Bakker. Before we start with him, I do want to put a trigger warning for sexual assault and drug use. Here we go. His first major scandal also happened in 1987. What a wild year. In March, to be precise, Jim Bakker spontaneously admitted to having had an affair before quitting his own show called Praise the Lord Club. What the hell happened, might you think? Well, 6 years earlier, Jim had an affair with a 21-year-old named Jessica Hahn, and let's not even point out how much older he was than her at that point. Jessica unfortunately described this sexual intercourse as non-consensual, and Bakker gave her $100,000 in hush money. In the meantime, the press finds out that during that time when that happened, his wife, Tammy Faye, was in and out of rehab. Jim was also rumored to have paid the services of male sex workers around that time. He never really commented on that latter scandal. In May of '87, the Bakkers are fired from their own show, the PTL Club, Praise the Lord Club. Then some financial scandals come to light in 1989 when Jim Bakker is sued for 8 counts of fraud by mail, 15 counts of electronic fraud, and 1 count of organized fraud. At the end of the trial, he was prosecuted for each and every count and was convicted of 45 years in prison, as well as a fine of $500,000. He appealed and he got a sentence reduction. His new sentence decreased to 8 years in prison for some reason, of which he will do 5 before being let out on parole in 1994. In the early 2000s, him and his new wife, Lori, by the way, Tammy Bakker, passed away in 1996. Him and his new wife worked towards relaunching Jim's career after the hiatus. In 2003, he created a new daily show, The Jim Bakker Show, and opens a new ministry called Morningside in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, an underprivileged rural area, by the way, which we'll circle back to later in this video. This specific choice of location, I mean. So he's been working on his new doctrine, and as of lately, he's turning more and more into like a doomsday kind of cult guy, you know what I mean? Like the apocalypse coming and all that shit, which I'm not surprised. But yeah, he also sells products such as dried food for his new apocalypse preppers audience and other miscellaneous potions, including a COVID cure. So by changing his doctrine and like stepping away from word of faith, he managed to attract a new audience that is not aware of his past actions. Smart. So yeah, he just He tends to steer more and more towards cult-like practices and stray from the Southern Baptist packaging he started off with. Okay, now circling back to our initial question, we observe that all three of these televangelists were able to win most of their audience back. Their stats are not the same as they were back in the 70s or 80s, of course, but it is not too bad. Mainstream media is partly to blame here, I think. Johannes Erhardt, I don't know how to pronounce their name, I'm so sorry, in his book, The Power of Scandal 2011, explains. The merciless moralizing of some variants of public opinion, for example, the notorious attacks of the British tabloid The Sun, allows even the most extreme televangelists to appear in a positive light of mercy. At the same time, the producers of public opinion are better protected than politicians and televangelists. After all, there is no third vantage point from which one can judge the judges. Televangelists and other wealthy public figures are easily forgiven. We know it all too well out here on the internet. Cancel culture just does not work once the person that's being pointed out for having done something terrible is too notorious. You know, it just doesn't work if the person is too popular. But okay, yeah, let's move on to our next part. Distrust towards science and conspiracy theories. It is not breaking news that Word of Faith televangelists preach and teach creationism, making science an opinion. A little reminder on creationism real quick. Opposing Darwin's theory of evolution, creationism is the belief that the universe and living organisms originate from specific acts of divine creation, which means men and women are direct descendants of Adam and Eve according to that doctrine. The theory pretty much ignores the scientific consensus and is assimilated to a pseudoscience. In that logic, science and religion cannot cohabit, and thus science is relegated to the status of being just an opinion. This is something that I hate so profoundly. In Hebrews 6:18, it is written, "It is impossible for God to lie." So yeah, that's enough apparently. God is the only source of truth. Science is invalid. Makes perfect sense. According to a survey conducted in April 2018 by the Pew Research Center, 66% of white evangelical Protestants think that humans have always existed in their present forms, aka are creationists, when 32% of them only are open to believe in the theory of evolution. It is also interesting to point out that the participants were not asked outright, "Are you a creationist?" using that terminology. No, they were asked exactly, or they were not asked anything. They were presented with a statement that was, humans have always existed in their present form. A, God had a role. B, God had no role. It makes sense because creationism is kind of a controversial word in the collective mind, and it is often mocked in mainstream media, whether it be in magazines or comedy. And that very fact actually benefits the televangelists, and that's one more thing that allows them to reel in their followers. The stigma of creationism is a perfect opportunity for televangelists to openly put themselves on the side of their congregation, because Word of Faith is, in essence, anti-system. It is just perfect for self-victimization. They feel othered, you know what I mean? And because they feel othered as a group, it allows for a stronger sense of community. Televangelists are well aware of that and validate their congregations in their beliefs and push them to be loud and proud about it. That is pretty much how they insufflate pseudoscience and conspiracy theories into their sermons. So the equation would be people on the outside of my religion plus mainstream media doesn't think like me equals they are wrong. Because they are wrong, that means I am right, and I will be loud by my controversial opinions because my community thinks the same as me. In his research book titled Selling Fear, Conspiracy Theories, and End Times Paranoia, Gregory S. Camp coins the term Christian conspiracism, emanating from the Christian right and the evangelical world in the US. It defines the appeal that evangelical charismatic figures and right-wing politicians have for creating stories alternative to science, and how they consciously build narrative that goes against the facts accepted by the larger parts of society. majority. To understand how conspiracy theories work on a congregation, psychology offers some explanations. In that sense, Professor Bradley Franks compares conspiracy theories to quasi-religious mentality. Franks attempts to make out why people believe in these theories and why they are so attractive to some people. According to him, conspiracy theories need these three criteria to function, taking into account those following points: how the potential believers are attracted, how conspiracy theories spread, how conspiracy theories cause collective actions. These three aspects are summarized in three key points: stick, spread, and action. Still according to Professor Frank, people that are attracted to conspiracy theories generally place themselves against established religion. Their pseudo-religious traits are defined by their content, their frame, and above all, the fact that they function alongside established religion. If those who adhere to conspiracy theories perceive themselves as being against the majority, we can think that, in a similar logic, they can adhere to the ideas of televangelists. It is an important point to make because not all Protestant or Southern Baptist pastors are creationists, or anti-science for that matter. The people who adhere to these conspiracies are those who feel rejected by an established system, and namely traditional Baptist or Protestant churches that don't share their ideas despite technically practicing the same religion. Professor Franks also adds another potential explanation. He thinks people attracted to alternate beliefs could do so out of anxiety and out of the fear of being othered. The charismatic leader is there to call for common sense and offer solutions to anxiety-inducing problems associated to conspiracy theories. The congregation gets the feeling that they have access to amazing counseling and that they're not alone with their unique set of beliefs. They believe they are the minority because the rest of society rejects those conspiracy theories. To illustrate the nature of the conspiracy theories brought forth by televangelists, let's start with Pat Robertson. He is a Word of Faith televangelist and regularly hosts the 700 Club. That crazy man and his other crazy man friend, aka Jerry Falwell, 2 days after the 9/11 attacks, said, and please listen to this, because this is ludicrous.
Throwing God out of the public square, out of the schools. The abortionists have got to bear some burden for this because God will not be mocked, and when we destroy 40 million little innocent babies, we make God mad. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians who are actively trying to make that an alternative lifestyle, the ACLU, People for the American Way, all of them who tried to secularize America, I point the finger in their face and say, you helped this happen.
The gays and the feminists did 9/11. And that wasn't even the worst thing that man ever said. That was not even his wildest take, I promise y'all. In 1991, I have to bring this up. In 1991, he published a book called The New World Order. Of course, it would be named that. And the central theme for it is that the Gulf War is really a setup by Bush so that he could create, you guessed it, the New World Order. By the way, this is not some fiction book. This is real to him. This is real to him. Some fun little entries that I liked in this book was how he accuses Bush to be a pawn in the creation of a new world controlled by Lucifer. I cannot believe Pat Robertson has me sounding like I am standing up for Bush. Robertson also mentions a global conspiracy that would go back many centuries, aka the Jewish bankers working towards a global dictatorship. Absolute, unhinged madness. Anywho, we clearly see that this is about identifying the enemies who are actively menacing Christian principles, right? The culprits have remained unchanged until the 60s, basically. So the LGBTQIA, the agnostics, the Jewish people, the feminists, Bush. And at the same time, the same tropes are being retold over and over and are still at the heart of televangelist sermons. In the same vein, on the 700 Club said in October 2009, in the midst of the H1N1 epidemic, Robertson advised against getting vaccinated because Obama could not be trusted. I'm not even gonna go and research what he could have said during the most recent panoramic because I feel like we can all guess. We can all guess. Public health, politics, established religion, all of these things are thrown in there in a chaotic way, but they are constantly being reiterated to the congregation. That kind of circles back to the first part of this deep dive when I talked about the process of mass hypnosis through linguistics used in the church. Beyond all of this, we also see a pattern of disinformation in general. So let's define that term real quick. Malinformation is the opposite of misinformation. Those are two very distinct terms. Misinformation is an honest mistake from a media or any other entity that has influence over a mass of people. However, malinformation is made to trump. It is a deliberate lie from a media or any other entity that has influence over a mass of people, according to Dr. Claire Wardle and Dr. Hossein Derakhshan from European Council 2017. This false information is harmful to the viewer because they usually are health related or safety related in general. On May 7th, 2010, Gloria Copeland promised her congregation that they are the only ones with the ability to control the weather.
But you are the one that has authority over the weather. There, and they just watched it, rebuked it. It never did anything. One day, I was in the airplane in the back, and my little brother was in the back with me, and Ken was up front flying, and we were not in the weather because we don't fly bad weather, but we could see the weather over here. And I looked out the window, and that tornado came down just like this, down toward the ground. And Ken said, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. You get back up there." So this is how I learned how to talk to tornadoes. I saw this. And that tornado went whoop, 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 whoop. Even while I was watching, and my little brother was not a devout Christian at that time, and that was really good for him to see. So you're the weatherman. You get out there, or the weather woman, whichever it is, and you talk to that thing, and you tell it, "You're not coming here. I command you to dissipate."
Here, she basically tells her congregation that their mesmerist abilities and their faith are strong enough to control a hurricane, aka a completely arbitrary phenomenon. In 2017, after the devastating Hurricane Harvey in Texas, near Corpus Christi, where the Copelands reside, many journalists humorously asked the couple why they didn't choose to stop the hurricane. Kenneth and Gloria Copeland don't stop Hurricane Harvey, PNP News. The journalist writes, they claim to be able to rebuke the weather, to be able to stop storms, yet the worst storm to hit their home state in 5 decades continues to soak Texas as the Copelands stand idly by. The blatant charlatan words from the Copelands make people laugh, and in that specific case, they don't really put anyone in direct danger, but there have been other instances of them putting forth some more damaging arguments. Word of Faith televangelists also tend to act like they have a medical degree and position themselves as doctors of the congregation. You can find an alarming amount of healing YouTube videos, compiling Bible citations said to help physical illness. Gloria Copeland positions herself as a huge skeptic of modern medicine and tells her audience to not seek professional medical care on a daily basis. In 1995, she published a book named God's Prescription for Divine Health, and this is how she introduces it. There is a medicine so powerful it can cure every sickness and disease known to man. It has no dangerous side effects. It is safe even in massive doses, and when taken daily according to directions, it can prevent illness altogether and keep you vibrant in health. Gloria speaks as if she was a specialist and targets her speech towards towards the people that are like her, people that have opened their eyes, if you know what I mean. She gave a conference in 2007 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and that rang very true because she kept saying how her congregation is so exceptional, so different, and thus has the ability to understand her words in depth, and how that makes them equipped to heal by the hand of God. So she puts her congregation on a pedestal and highlights their intelligence, their abilities, and she says that she is flattered that such an amazing bunch of people are on her side. She justifies this skepticism towards modern science with a passage in Proverbs 4:22, "For they are life to those who find them and health to all their flesh." She even has a healing school, which is actually just her personal website, that she describes as follows. "In the 45 plus years I've been a believer, I've discovered another, much more effective kind of medicine. The Word of God. There's never been a miracle drug that could equal it. God's medicine is the answer to every need. It is life. It is health. It is the power of God. And if you put it in your heart and act on it, you will be healed." Users have the possibility to come and ask their own medical questions. And Gloria, or her team, who knows, gives medical advice. One in particular caught my attention, and don't get me wrong, like all of them are bad, but this one, it just goes straight to the point. So the user asks, "Is it okay to take medicine?" Alarming. To which logically Gloria replies, "If you have submitted your health or the treatment of a medical condition to a doctor, you should follow the doctor's instructions, including using the medicines prescribed." Not that bad, right? But wait, there's more, because she goes on inserting passages from the Bible and orients the user to a Bible study article about health and medical drugs. She continues with, "Find scriptures about the part of your body or life that is under the attack of the enemy. Use God's word like medicine and see your health improve. Always respond with the word of God. It is the final authority." So thank you for that disclaimer in the first sentence, Gloria. But that's literally not enough. She's literally just trying to protect herself because she's not trying to catch a lawsuit. That kind of dichotomy is not super present in her sermons, like oral spoken sermons. For instance, in 2018, she posts on her public Facebook page a video called "Gloria Copeland Talks About the Flu," in which she declares,
Well, listen, partners, we don't have a flu season. We've got a duck season, a deer season, but we don't have a flu season. Jesus himself gave us the flu shot. He redeemed us from the curse of flu, and we receive it and we take it, and we are healed by his stripes.
Just to be clear, when she says Jesus gave us the flu shot, she doesn't mean Jesus went into the lab and created the flu shot. She means we don't need a flu shot because Jesus' love will make up for it. No. She's an anti-vaxxer at heart. She doesn't believe in vaccines. She doesn't believe in epidemics or pandemics for that matter. So instead of a flu shot, she tells her congregation to perform manifestations and to repeat over and over, "I will never have the flu and God will deliver because faith heals." I will quickly give an example of how the COVID pandemic was addressed in the televangelism world, but I won't linger because it grinds my gears too bad because they sucked pre-pandemic and they got a lot fucking worse. So yeah, Jim Baker sold pseudo medicine called the Silver Solution, which is said to be a COVID cure and protects the elderly against COVID. I wonder why he chose that specific demographic, huh? Anyhow, the elixir was sold for $80 a dose and was supposedly FDA approved. How convenient. Also, it is a cure for COVID and SARS and AIDS. Jim Baker is really out here saving lives, you know? However, Jim's dream of becoming the best doctor in America apparently was cut short because he was sued by the state of Missouri for promoting fake medicine. Oops. Whoopsies. But no, yeah, really, thank God he was stopped because that is so dangerous. So, after having gone in depth into the conspiracy theories and medical malinformation, I'm wondering, what is their goal? I mean, money, yes, for sure. But there's gotta be more to it. Like, they're doing the most. So let's move on to our third and last part of this deep dive. Religious manipulation and leaving word of faith. So let's start out with the concept of abuse of the state of weakness. I'm going to use a French definition here because the concept is overall absent from the American Book of Laws, but we'll go back to that in a minute. According to the French Code Pénal or Penal Code, Book of Laws, basically, the description reads, the abuse of weakness is the fraudulent abuse of a state of ignorance or of a state of weakness, either of a minor or of a person with a specific vulnerability because of their age, an illness, a disability, or because of the state of pregnancy, or, and this is the one we're most interested in, of a person in a state of physical constraint or psychological indoctrination resulting from serious pressure or repeated techniques aimed at altering their judgment to drive that person to an act that is gravely prejudicial to that said person. So that's a simplified translation, but you get the gist. In French law, the focus is placed on the victim and their pre-existing weakness that was taken advantage of or abused by another person in a position of power. American law, however, doesn't have a direct equivalent. The closest to that in America would be institutional abuse, but it only aims to defend the elderly that got abused, either financially or physically, or towards abused children in the system. In American law, there are hundreds of sorts of abuse, but religious abuse is not acknowledged or considered to be an offense. However, religious abuse or spiritual abuse exists in psychology. In word of faith churches, they abuse the state of weakness of a person by practicing, for instance, love bombing, which is a term that was coined by Margaret Singer in 1977. It gets thrown around a lot these days though, so let's take a look at the official definition. It is the display of affection toward new and potential converts, love bombing, which might be interpreted as a kindness or idealistic manifestation of devotees' belief that their relationship to spiritual truth and divine love enables them to radiate love and win others to truth, is also commonly interpreted as a sinister, coercive technique. I personally experienced love bombing when I visited that church, that Word of Faith church back in Milwaukee. They had never seen me before. I told them I was new in the neighborhood and that I was church shopping, because apparently that's a thing. They hugged me, they kissed me on the cheeks, they gave me hot chocolate and snacks, and they were just overall overly friendly and affectionate. And honestly, it felt so sincere. I was almost convinced. I felt empowered by this intense sense of community. Researchers David Johnson and Jeff Van Vonderen are the first to define the term religious and or spiritual abuse in 1991 by those words. Spiritual abuse can occur when a leader uses his or her spiritual position to control or dominate another person. It often involves overriding the feelings and opinions of another without regard to what will result in the other person's state of living, emotions, or spiritual well-being. David Henk adds more to the definition in the Watchman Fellowship Profile Journal. Spiritual abuse is the misuse of a position of power, leadership, or influence to further the selfish interest of someone other than the individual who needs help. Sometimes abuse arises out of a doctrinal position. At other times, it occurs because of legitimate personal needs of a leader that are met by illegitimate means. Spiritually abusive religious systems are sometimes described as legalistic, mind-controlling, religiously addictive, and authoritarian. Many points are put forward in that definition that Henk classifies within 5 categories that create an abusive religious landscape. First, he mentions an authoritarian quality emanating from the leader. Given that that the latter was appointed by God. Literally, that's what many televangelists say. They're my primary source here. The leader grants himself to have control over his congregation. Then Hank goes into how the leader portrays himself, and Hank calls that category the image conscious. The leader has full control over his image and what of him goes out into the world. The end goal being perfection. After that, he brings up the suppresses criticism principle, which is, well, when the leader manages to suppress all capacity of judgment in his followers. What the leader says will not and cannot be put into question. And if a follower is in disagreement or asks too many questions, then they are the one in the wrong, and that means that their faith is not strong enough. The fourth principle he points a finger at is the extreme perfectionism. The follower whose prayers are left unanswered is considered as imperfect, sinful, leading to their failure, basically. Flaws are highly frowned upon and have to be eliminated by faith. And finally, fifth and last category, Hank talks about an imbalanced system. So yeah, leaders offer such an imbalanced practice of religion that is disguised as out-of-the-box ideas that tries so hard to stand out in the middle of other religions and thus becomes more and more precious and valuable in the eyes of God. It's like they're so quirky they can't be like the other religions, you know? So yeah, Hank's categories are so fitting to televangelists. They check just about every box on that list. So undeniably, this abuse of weakness can lead to psychological consequences, but also physical consequences, or both. Why am I yelling? The first stage of psychological abuse is in the form of guilt put on the follower's shoulders. I sent more questions to Pete Evans from the Trinity Foundation, whom I had interviewed for my part 2 of this deep dive. I asked him how important guilt is in the Word of Faith movement, and from his response, it is pretty central. He remembers a specific story that stuck with him for the past 20-ish years. So one day in the early 2000s, a lady called the Trinity Foundation to tell her story as a victim. She explains that her 13-year-old daughter had multiple sclerosis and that she saw on TV that Robert Tilton had cured someone who had the same disease after that person had given Tilton $1,000. The mother of the sick child was interested and wanted to try that for her daughter. From a psychology point of view, she was desperate and vulnerable and thus willing to try anything to help her daughter out. So she sends a letter to Robert Tilton, and he advised she sends $8,000 by mail to his ministry and assured her daughter would be cured from multiple sclerosis. The mother worked really hard for a whole year to gather that amount of money because it's a lot of money for the regular civilian. She gave the money to Tilton, but nothing happened. Her daughter was not cured. It was actually the contrary. Her disease was progressing because multiple sclerosis is a degenerative disease, right? The mother called Robert Tilton's ministry with the intent to get answers, and the person she had on the phone told her that her daughter was probably carrying sin within her that she kept hidden, thus preventing God to heal her. Following that phone call, that woman's daughter fell into a deep depression because of the guilt she felt. She ended up taking her life in a very graphic way that I am not going to discuss here, but it involved fire. It is such a violent, rare, and tragic way to go. But according to Pete Evans, violent suicides are fairly common among televangelist followers. A blogger by the name of Heather Z, or the Whittier housewife, writes her own experience with religious trauma and testifies of her years within the Word of Faith movement. She looks back on that period of her life and how much guilt it brought her every time she felt like she was doing something that strayed from the principles. But she remembers one specific moment of her life when she felt immense guilt: her miscarriage. She writes that one day early in her pregnancy, she started cramping and bleeding, and that she didn't really worry at first because of the Word of Faith doctrine, because of the name it and claim it principle, the mesmerist principle. Here is her story and how she felt during that time. I quickly relied on my word of faith training, rebuking and binding, naming and claiming, using the authority I had assumed I had in Jesus. Even so, I ended up in the hospital that night instead of at our friend's home. An ultrasound revealed that I had lost the baby even after all of my positive confessions and faith-filled words. Robert and I were devastated. I really believed that it was all my fault, even though my doctor explained to me that I didn't physically do anything wrong. My body just couldn't or wouldn't support the child. Even so, I was convinced I lost our baby because my faith was weak. Yet another golden opportunity for me to search for the truth had slipped by. Kenneth Copeland lay on people who know God is trying to correct them via sickness, but who will go to the doctor. This is when people like Kenneth Copeland often claim the person is fighting against God's will if they go to the doctor, knowing God is trying to correct them with illness. Another testimony I thought was worth getting into is told by Vicky Crenshaw, whose mother passed away because she was encouraged and influenced to choose word of faith healing over modern medicine. So Vicky's mother, Elizabeth, was diagnosed with colon cancer, unfortunately, and started to make donations to Robert Tilton in hopes that God will perform a miracle and cure her. Vicky remembers her mother being in terrible physical pain, constantly crying because she refused to take any painkillers because Tilton advised against it. Allegedly. But yeah, Vicky would beg her mom to go seek professional help at the hospital to get treatment, but her mom was too indoctrinated and vulnerable and never doubted for a second that God would heal her if she kept donating and praying. To Elizabeth, going and seeking modern treatments would prove a lack of faith, and she was scared that God would turn his back on her if she did that. Vicky tried to prove to her mom that televangelists were charlatans time and time again, but her mom simply would not and could not hear it. Vicky somehow managed to pull her mother out after some time and hard work, and Elizabeth ended up suing Tilton, but nothing came of it. It was too late. She sadly passed away before he could be prosecuted. I mean, it's just like when you're in a toxic relationship. You realize how bad it was once you leave, right? But obviously leaving a religious movement is never easy. Jean-Claude Mess, a Belgian psychiatrist specialized in cult patterns, puts forth 4 steps followers go through in their journey. The first step would be the seduction step, what makes a person want to join a movement. Second step is the guilt trip step, what the leader says so that a follower erases their flaws and conforms to the movement's doctrine. The third step is déresponsabilisation, which I could not really come up with an English equivalent, but it is the idea of someone deconstructing their guilt, which is the first step towards the exit. And this step is generally triggered by someone outside the movement, by a third party like a family member, spouse, or a close friend or something. And then the fourth and last step would be disalienation, aka the follower wins back their independence and finds their personal critical system of thoughts again. Romy Sauvage, in her thesis called Croire à l'incroyable, which is roughly believe the unbelievable in English, she sheds light on what she calls an impermeability of beliefs between themselves. And that is really interesting. She explains the concept by the fact that a follower cannot possibly put their doctrine into question based on contradictions pointed out by a loved one or someone on the outside of the cult. It is also the fact that a follower will not leave a cult because they are faced with a contradiction within their own doctrine. For instance, in the case of Word of Faith, you are told that if you give money to the televangelist, you will be cured, right? Well, when that doesn't happen, followers are shaken, but it doesn't necessarily push them to leave. Like, it's not enough. Another kind of contradiction Romy analyzes is what she calls an axis contradiction, which occurs when a leader tells a follower to do something that goes against what's left of their principles. This type of contradiction is less frontal and shocking than the previous one, but if the follower encounters an accumulation of axis contradictions, then they have a better chance at snapping out of it. Little by little, the follower will notice some inconsistencies or disturbing orders, such as wild interpretations of the Bible, for example, political disagreements and stuff like that. And as the time goes, the follower will reach a point of no return and then start to stray away from the movement. I found an anonymous testimony of someone describing this buildup of axis contradictions. That person explains having been part of Copeland's ministries from 1990 to 2005 before becoming a pastor under the Copeland's ministry as well from 2004 to 2007. He started to notice some discrepancies when he became a pastor and started to study the Word of Faith doctrine in detail. Very quickly, he was bothered by the fact that humans were presented as little gods in the Word of Faith doctrine. He thought that was a contradiction and a wild interpretation of scriptures. When I read his testimony, I could tell he regrets having given so much time and energy to the Copelands and their ministry. He says stuff like, I should have seen this all from the beginning, but I didn't. Or, the reason the Word of Faith doctrine fooled me and millions of other Christians is that there is a lot of biblical truth in it. It's the rest that's poisoned. You can read the whole testimony, by the way, on xwordoffaith.blogspot.com if you're interested. But yeah, he goes on to say that he was the witness of a lot of wrongdoings, such as abuse, scams, lies, and that over time he started to be convinced that the Copelands didn't have anyone's best interests at heart but their own, even though they remained overly nice and sympathetic to their followers. So it was hard for anyone really to believe that they'd be allegedly involved in such dark business. He writes that his wake-up call happened when he discovered the concept of shepherding. It is a set of beliefs and teachings aiming at putting pressure on the believer in order to guilt trip them, basically, which is a form of spiritual abuse. Here is the rest of the definition. Shepherding began around 1974. The original concept of shepherding was created by 5 South Florida pastors, Bob Mumford, Derek Prince, Charles Simpson, Ern Baxter, and Don Basham, as a way to deal with what they saw as a dissolution of the charismatic movement. It stated that the pastor of the church provided an umbrella of protection for the congregation, shielding them from the evil outside. To enjoy this protection, the congregation had to submit to the pastor's authority. So this testimony shows us that it takes a lot of deconstructing and many years to finally feel ready to leave. And even after having left an extreme religious movement, the process is not over, because ex-followers often suffer from RTS, religious traumatic syndrome, as it was coined by Dr. Marlene Winnell in her article for the British Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Psychotherapies. She defines this syndrome as being triggered by chronic mental and psychological abuse emanating from toxic religious settings. She says it could be a combination between a post-traumatic syndrome, which occurs when a person is faced with death or injury trauma, and a complex post-traumatic syndrome, which is when a person is faced with a traumatic event that doesn't involve death, but during which that person was not able to defend themselves. Dr. Winnell found out that in the long term, RTS can provoke literal cerebral lesions, like actual physical manifestations of trauma and religious trauma can happen. So we understand that religious trauma is real and tangible, and that a long process of reconstruction after having left the movement is often necessary for a person to recover their judgment and their overall psychological well-being. Okay. All right, I think I've been shooting this video for like 3 hours and we are done. So that was part 3 out of 3. Thank you for watching. And yeah, it was probably a lot longer than my previous ones, but I hope you enjoyed it. It was really fun, really interesting, hopefully to you. But yeah, I will be back in another video with a probably whole different topic. And by the way, if you have any suggestions, go over to my Instagram and message me with any of your ideas on video essay topics, because that could be interesting. But yeah, I hope you liked it. As usual, if you didn't like it, don't tell me because I will cry. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye. Goodbye.